The air in Newburyport that October had a quiet bite to it, the kind that slides into your bones and makes the wood floors creak just a little more under your wheels. Margaret Sloane sat in her wheelchair near the bay window of the colonial home she'd owned for over 30 years. Outside, the sugar maples had begun their fiery transformation, their amber leaves catching the last light of the day like kindling not yet lit. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock she'd brought from her first office, the one she kept through every expansion, every move, every success. She hadn't always lived like this, stilled from the waist down, a prisoner to her once stubborn body. Just a year ago, she'd still been attending board meetings, if not with fire, then with grace and steel. A fall in her kitchen, a clot, a rush to the hospital, and then paralysis. Just like that. Her body refused her, without negotiation, without remorse. It had been Ethan, her son, who visited her first, just days after she was discharged from rehab. He brought roses and a Bluetooth speaker that he connected to her living room stereo. "You can play jazz again, Mom," he'd said, tapping away on his phone while barely making eye contact. He stayed 40 minutes, told her about quarterly reports, a new branding initiative, and a pitch to investors in Miami. Then he vanished again, like a season that never quite settles. It was Claire who stayed. Margaret still remembered the sound of the suitcase wheels, two of them, clicking on the slate floor when Claire walked in unannounced one rainy Tuesday. She'd looked tired. Her coat was soaked through, her brown hair pulled back in a careless bun. She didn't say anything poetic or dramatic. She just placed her bag down, walked into the den, and said, "I'll sleep in here. I already called work." A resignation, maybe, or a declaration of loyalty. Either way, it stuck. Claire had always been the quiet one. Not meek, but private. The kind of child who didn't scream to be seen, who built forts from library books, who wrote lists instead of diaries. She had become a human resources manager, of course. A woman of structure and silent strength. And now, she was here, feeding tubes, changing linens, managing medication, even updating company ledgers on her mother's behalf. She never brought up her divorce, and Margaret never asked. There were larger things to survive now. On the 9th day before the wedding, the phone rang. Margaret had a second to feel grateful before dread settled. It was Ethan. His voice was flat, practiced. "I don't think it's a good idea for you to come to the wedding, Mom," he said, with no hesitation. "Vanessa thinks it might be awkward. People will feel weird. You know, the chair." The words didn't burn right away. They hung in the air, weightless and absurd, like a child's cruel joke. But as the silence stretched, reality snapped them into place like glass breaking on cold tile. "Okay," she said softly. Not in agreement, just as a recognition. A full stop. She ended the call without another word and looked across the kitchen to Claire, who had stopped measuring out her mother's medications and was just standing there, still and waiting. "We're not staying here," Margaret said. Claire didn't ask why. She simply nodded and walked to the bedroom. That night, while Claire packed, Margaret stared at the photograph on the living room wall. A younger version of herself, arms crossed in front of the original warehouse she had bought with a third mortgage and a stomach full of ulcers. She had the flu that day but refused to go home. "If they see me sick," she once told her foreman, "they'll think I'm soft." That photo hung in every office she'd ever had. And now, she would take it with her, one last time. They left before sunrise. No goodbye. No lawyers informed. Not even Ethan's secretary. Just gone. The apartment Claire found had wide hallways for the wheelchair and a south-facing kitchen that welcomed morning light. It was clean, functional, modest. A far cry from the 4-story home with the wine cellar and view of the river. But here, Margaret could breathe. Claire labeled every drawer, organized the closets by color, and refused to cry. Not even once. Even when Margaret stared blankly at the RSVP envelope that had arrived 3 days later, thick cream cardstock with gold embossing, Claire said nothing. Margaret nudged it into the trash with the side of her hand. Ethan didn't call again. Vanessa didn't send so much as a text. But the photos arrived, digital echoes of a celebration Margaret was never meant to witness. Ethan in a bespoke suit she hadn't paid for. Vanessa in a gown that likely cost a semester's tuition. White arches. smiles wide as storefronts. Captioned, "A strong new beginning." No mention of family. No mention of her. That night, Margaret asked Claire for the lockbox. The old one. Metal. Heavy. Tucked under the bed since before Ethan was born. Claire placed it in her mother's lap, her fingers ready on the latch when Margaret whispered, "Open it for me." Inside were legal documents, handwritten letters, birth certificates, memories folded into permanence. Margaret removed a folder marked succession. The old will, 70-30, Ethan first, Claire second. She stared at it, then tore it straight down the middle. Claire didn't flinch. She didn't cry, didn't ask. "I'm not doing this because I'm angry," Margaret said. "I know," Claire replied. Then Margaret handed her a pen. "You're the successor now," she said. "Start where it says, transfer of ownership." Claire took the pen. She didn't smile. She didn't pause. She just signed. That night was quiet in a way that Margaret would remember until her last breath. Not hollow. Not sad. Just still. A stillness that only comes after the storm has passed and all that remains is honesty. No one had one. But someone had stayed. And in that staying, something had been earned. Not power. Not pity. But trust. And for a woman who had built an empire on the weight of her own name, trust was the only real inheritance worth passing on. It began quietly. Most wars do. There was no shouting match, no slammed doors, no handwritten letters returned unopened. There was only a change in the tone of Ethan's voice, the subtle omission of Margaret's name from company newsletters, and a growing sense of distance, measured not in miles, but in deliberate silences. Margaret noticed the first shift when she visited the company's website one morning, navigating slowly with trembling fingers and eyes that blinked more often than they used to. The About Us section had been rewritten. Her name, once prominently listed as founder and visionary, had been condensed into a vague, established by family pioneers. The photo of the original warehouse she mortgaged her life to buy? Gone. Replaced by Ethan in a navy suit, arms crossed in front of a green screen skyline. The branding was clean, slick, devoid of soul. She didn't say anything. Not yet. Instead, she called her attorney. Claire found her sitting in the breakfast nook, a yellow legal pad in her lap, notes in perfect cursive. It was the same penmanship she'd used on balance sheets 30 years ago when she was the one signing checks, not being passed over. "What are you working on?" Claire asked, placing a plate of toast beside her mother's elbow. Margaret didn't look up. "I'm just double-checking some things. Making sure my name still means something." Claire didn't press. She knew better. Vanessa's influence grew faster than any quarterly projection Ethan had ever sent home. A former model turned lifestyle influencer, she had perfected the art of commanding a room without saying much at all. Everything about her felt curated, from her minimalist wardrobe to the effortless way she leaned in when someone important was speaking. Margaret met her only twice. That was enough. The first time, Vanessa walked into the house with a practiced smile and called Margaret, "Ma'am," twice in the same sentence, never once looking her in the eye. She complimented the architecture, noted how vintage the furniture looked, and declined the soup Claire had made, citing a gluten intolerance, before downing 2 glasses of wine. The second time, she stood beside Ethan at a board meeting, not as a guest, but as an advisor, clicking through a pitch deck she hadn't built, speaking about synergy, market perception, and demographic rebranding. She pointed to Ethan's image, then added with a rehearsed grin, "We need to show strength. Stability. Not legacy." That word hit like a slap dressed in silk. Legacy. Discarded like yesterday's font. Margaret said nothing. But that night, she called Claire into her room. The walls were lined with old certificates, faded Polaroids, and shelves of business books with dog-eared pages. Margaret's lap was covered with papers, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. "You need to get ready," she said simply. "For what?" "For when this breaks." Claire didn't ask what this was. She just nodded and pulled a chair closer. 3 weeks later, it broke. It came in the form of a phone call, short, clinical, and cold. "Mom," Ethan said, I think it's better if you don't come to the wedding. Margaret closed her eyes. It'll be hard for people. The wheelchair, it might be uncomfortable for the guests. Vanessa agrees. It wasn't the words that crushed her. It was the voice, so devoid of hesitation, like he was canceling a lunch meeting. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She hung up. Then she turned to Claire, who was sorting medications by the kitchen window. We're not staying, Margaret said. Okay, Claire answered. They left the house before sunrise, the one with the bay window and the wooden steps Margaret could no longer climb. Claire had packed everything the night before, neatly, efficiently, like she'd done this before. Margaret had taken only what mattered: 2 framed photos, her original company seal, and the lockbox. It was raining when they drove out of the driveway. Margaret didn't look back. In their new place, a modest 2-bedroom apartment with laminate floors and a microwave that made a clicking sound when it ran, Margaret began her quiet war. She spent hours reviewing deeds, cross-referencing ownership rights, confirming every signature, clause, and controlling interest. Everything was still under her name. Ethan had never actually inherited the company. She had allowed him to run things, to speak publicly, to play the part. But the truth? Legally, she still owned it all. He had been standing on borrowed ground. And he never noticed. Vanessa, it seemed, noticed too late. By the time she started inserting herself into high-level meetings and speaking on Ethan's behalf, investors began to ask questions. Why wasn't Margaret present? Where was the founder? Why had her name disappeared from documents? One particularly sharp investor, a woman from Boston named Roslyn, caught Vanessa after a lunch meeting and said, "You do realize the matriarch still holds the reins, right? You can't rebrand someone else's kingdom unless you own the crown." Vanessa blinked. That night, Ethan called Margaret again. She didn't answer. It wasn't revenge that drove Margaret to rewrite the will. It wasn't ego. It was clarity. Ethan had mistaken visibility for ownership. He had confused applause with power. He thought the nameplate on the office door meant permanence. But he had never paid the dues. He hadn't folded invoices at midnight, hadn't lost sleep over payroll, hadn't begged the bank manager for a 6-month extension when the economy collapsed. Claire, on the other hand, had never asked for anything. But she showed up. Every day. With her hair in a bun, her sleeves rolled up, and a quiet look that said, "I've got this." Margaret signed the revised documents at the kitchen table. The lockbox was open beside her. Claire sat across, silent, watching her mother slide one paper at a time into a neatly labeled folder. When it was done, Margaret looked up. "Do you understand what this means?" "Yes," Claire said. Margaret nodded, tears finally gathering, not from sadness, but relief. "I just wanted someone to remember where it all started." Claire reached across the table, took her mother's hand, and squeezed. "I remember." It had rained for 2 days straight. The kind of soft, constant drizzle that made everything feel slower. Inside their small apartment, 2 bedrooms, narrow kitchen, and a view of a cracked parking lot, Margaret sat quietly by the window. A mug of chamomile sat cooling on the table beside her, untouched. Claire was labeling files in the next room, her rhythm steady as always. The place smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and worn paper. There was nothing glamorous about their lives now, no black car service, no catered lunches, no boardroom applause. But there was peace. Peace was a hard-won currency. Margaret had never been afraid of silence. It was in the silence that she built her empire. While others shouted, she listened. While they chased, she prepared. That's why, when she reached under her bed for the lockbox, the one that hadn't been opened since before Ethan had whisked Vanessa into their world, she did it with reverence. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from weight. Inside were the last legal remnants of her legacy: titles, deeds, contracts, original formation documents from a time when her name meant something, whispered with both fear and respect in logistics circles across New England. She placed the will on the table like a relic. Claire walked in, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, her brow furrowed as soon as she saw it. "Mom." Margaret didn't answer. She took a long, slow breath and then, with no ceremony, no announcement, tore the will in half. Then she folded it again and tore it once more, the pieces landing like dry leaves on the table. Claire stood still, towel in hand. Margaret looked up. Her voice didn't waver. "I'm done pretending he's ready." Claire didn't ask who. She didn't need to. She just nodded and quietly retrieved a pen from the drawer. The paperwork took days to finalize. Margaret had it notarized, witnessed, and reviewed by her attorney twice. It was thorough, airtight, and irreversible. The will, the company, the real estate portfolio, every asset and line of control legally transferred to Claire. Not as a favor. Not as an emotional gesture. But as a strategic move made by a founder who knew exactly where value lived. Claire had never asked for it. That was the point. And Ethan? He didn't even know it was happening. He found out 2 weeks later. It began with a renovation request. Ethan had planned to gut the master bathroom in the family estate, the same house Margaret had left without a word. His assistant filed the permits. The contractor scheduled demolition. The call came back. Permit denied. Ethan was confused. Why? The town clerk replied plainly, "You don't own the property." He laughed. "That's impossible." He called his lawyer. The lawyer called the registry. And then the panic began. Within 24 hours, Ethan lost access to all back-end systems at the company. His admin logins were deactivated. His keycard didn't work. The board received notice that all decisions now required Claire's signature as managing partner. A memo was circulated explaining the updated ownership structure. Most of the staff were shocked. Some weren't, because Claire had been doing the work quietly for months. And Margaret? She hadn't stepped foot in the office since her paralysis, but every paper, every document, every transfer still carried her name. Until now. Ethan had never truly been Sue. He just worn the title. 3 days after that, Vanessa was gone. No note. No explanation. Just an empty closet, bank alerts, and one voicemail Ethan never told anyone about. She'd taken everything they had jointly owned, cash reserves, a curated watch collection, vintage jewelry from her modeling days, even a limited edition sound system he never used. The prenuptial agreement? Rewritten under the guidance of a friend of hers who never passed the bar. It wouldn't hold up. Ethan was stunned. Alone in a penthouse he no longer recognized, surrounded by curated furniture and hollow promises. And then he did something Margaret never expected. He came back. It was a Thursday. The light outside had that golden, late autumn hue that made the peeling paint on their apartment door seem less sad and more earned. Margaret was by the window again, her legs bundled in a knit blanket. Claire was in the kitchen, organizing Margaret's pill tray for the week. There was a knock. Claire didn't react at first. But Margaret did. She turned her head slowly and just stared. The knock came again. Louder this time. Margaret nodded toward the door. Claire stepped quietly to the peephole. Then she sighed. "It's him." Ethan looked thinner. Tired. The expensive coat no longer fit his shoulders. His hair was messy, like he hadn't tried. He stood alone, a small overnight bag at his feet. His hands were clenched in front of him. When Claire opened the door, she didn't say anything. He didn't step forward. "I just want to talk to her," he said, voice low. "Please." Claire glanced back at Margaret, who met her gaze for a long second before nodding once. Ethan stepped inside like a man walking into a church. Margaret didn't turn her wheelchair. She kept facing the window. "You lied to me," she said. "Not once. Not with words. But with who you chose to become." Ethan didn't deny it. "I know. You asked me not to come to your wedding because you were embarrassed of me." He closed his eyes. "I was wrong." "You were weak," Margaret corrected, voice flat. "And weakness isn't what makes me turn away. Cowardice does." Ethan took a shaky breath. She left. Margaret turned now, slowly, facing her son fully for the first time in months. "She wasn't the one who broke this," she said. "She just handed you the mirror." Ethan swallowed. "I need help," he whispered. "I have nothing left." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was honest. Claire stood nearby, arms crossed, unreadable. Margaret looked at her daughter, then back at her son. "Everything I built," she said, I left with the person who stayed. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. She pointed to the door. There's a sofa in the laundry room. If you want a place to sleep while you figure out how to become a man again, it's yours. He nodded. No arguments. No thank yous. Just acceptance. That night, he unfolded the cot without a word. He found clean sheets stacked neatly on the shelf. Claire had anticipated this. Or maybe she just always prepared for the worst. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He simply lay there, staring at the ceiling of a room he never thought he'd live in. A room that didn't echo with applause. A room with no trophies or titles. Just quiet, old walls and the muffled sound of his sister's footsteps on the kitchen floor above. And it was there, in that stillness, that Ethan finally learned what legacy really meant. The cot in the laundry room creaked every time Ethan turned over. It wasn't made for comfort, just steel legs, a thin mattress, and a scratchy wool blanket Claire had folded neatly at the foot. The room smelled faintly of detergent and lemon floor cleaner. There were no windows, no curtains, no luxuries. Just a shelf of paper towels, a drying rack, and one cold tile floor that squeaked under bare feet. And yet, it was the first place he'd truly slept in months. No insomnia from pitch decks. No cold sheets beside a body that had already left. No noise from a city that never gave him rest. Only quiet. Quiet and consequence. 3 days earlier, his mother had looked him in the eye and said, "There's no title, no inheritance. Just a bed and a meal if you're willing to clean." He'd nodded then. Not because he understood, but because he had nothing left to bargain with. Each morning, Ethan rose early. He'd leave the cot exactly as he found it. Sheets tight, corners tucked, pillow fluffed. Then he'd sweep the kitchen before anyone walked in. Not because it was asked of him. Just because. He started making coffee by 6:30 a.m., learning the way his mother liked it. 2 sugars, no cream. Claire took hers black. Always had. He didn't try to make conversation. He didn't ask questions. He just showed up. One morning, as he reached for the broom, he noticed a plate in the fridge wrapped in plastic wrap. On top was a sticky note in Claire's handwriting. Eat. No smiley face. No flourish. Just one word. He ate in silence, then washed the dish, dried it, and returned it to the cabinet. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been completely exiled. Just demoted. And maybe that was the point. A week passed. He fixed the squeaky cabinet door in the bathroom. Replaced a dead bulb in the hallway without asking. When Margaret's chair got stuck on the carpet edge, he knelt and trimmed it to level. She didn't thank him. But she also didn't stop him. That night, Claire left half a sandwich in the fridge. No note this time. Just half a sandwich, turkey, no mayo, the kind she used to make when they were kids, racing off to school while their mother yelled reminders from behind her morning coffee. Ethan stood at the fridge for a long time, hand hovering over the plate like it was sacred. He ate it standing up. One afternoon, Margaret had trouble reaching the curtain string in the living room. Ethan, without being asked, stepped behind her and gently pulled it open, letting the sunlight in. She didn't acknowledge him. But she didn't recoil either. Later that night, as Claire boiled water for tea, Margaret said aloud, almost like she was speaking to herself, "The light makes it easier to see." Claire didn't reply, but Ethan heard it. And he knew what it meant. It wasn't about the window. It was about him. There were no apologies. That was never how their family worked. Forgiveness wasn't theatrical, it was practical. You proved it by showing up, not by saying the right thing. Ethan started anticipating the small things. Claire's water glass never ran empty, Margaret's slippers were always placed next to her chair. He restocked the toilet paper before anyone noticed it was low. He ironed pillowcases. He took the trash out without being told. The cot remained in the laundry room. He never asked to leave it. But on the 12th night, Claire opened the door and quietly placed a second pillow on his cot. She didn't say a word. Just set it down and left. Ethan stared at it for a long time. Not because it was soft, but because it meant he was still here. 2 weeks in, Ethan accompanied Claire to the post office. Not because she needed help, but because he offered. She gave a single nod and handed him the package. They walked in silence. As they waited in line, he glanced at her, then down at his shoes. "You always like the quiet, huh?" Claire didn't look up from the envelope. "You just never noticed." It wasn't said with malice. It was said with truth. That was worse. That night, Margaret motioned for him to wheel her from the living room to the dining area. She didn't speak during the ride. When they stopped, she placed her hands in her lap and said, "You used to think leadership was about being the loudest person in the room." Ethan didn't argue. "You wore suits, shook hands, took pictures," she said. "But you never asked who stayed late to close the books. You never noticed who brought the sandwiches." He stared at the floor. "I'm trying now." "I know." Silence again. Then she added, "But trying isn't the same as earning." One morning, a package arrived from the logistics company. Ethan lifted it onto the counter, then paused when he saw the return address, corporate headquarters, the building with his old office. His hands lingered on the seal before Claire brushed past him, took a knife, and opened the box without ceremony. Inside, quarterly reports, contract drafts, a replacement nameplate. Claire Sloan, managing director. She didn't flinch when she saw it. Just nodded and said, "Finally." Ethan didn't speak. He just reached into the drawer for the recycling bin. And for the first time, Claire let her eyes rest on him. Not coldly, not kindly. Just knowingly. Like she saw him. Later that evening, as Margaret dozed off in her chair and the house fell into that quiet lull that comes with 9 p.m. tea, Ethan walked into the kitchen and paused. Claire was drying a saucepan. He didn't move closer. He didn't sit. "I just want you to know," he said, "I don't expect anything back. I'm not here for the company. Or money. Or a second shot." She didn't respond. "I just don't want to be the kind of man who vanishes when things get real." Still, no reply. She placed the pan on the rack and turned off the kitchen light behind her. As she passed him in the doorway, she said one thing. "Then don't." That was enough. That was all he needed. Not a pardon. Just a place. Not as the man with the answers, but as the one who was finally learning how to ask the right questions. The first time Ethan held the door open for Margaret's wheelchair without being asked, she didn't comment. She just rolled through with a silent grace, nodding once as if she'd expected nothing less. That nod, brief and wordless, meant more than any boardroom applause he'd ever received. He had stopped trying to explain himself weeks ago. No more long speeches, no dramatic reconciliations. His new life wasn't about recovery, it was about presence. Humble, routine presence. The Ethan Sloan of old had been everywhere. Podcasts, panels, profile pieces in glossy magazines that celebrated the young face of a legacy brand. But that version had vanished, swallowed up by quiet shame, by the echo of his mother's words. "You wore the title. You didn't carry the weight." Now he carried groceries. He checked the porch light when it flickered. He helped Margaret into bed when Claire came home late from the office. He didn't ask to attend company meetings. He just folded laundry in the next room. In the business world, Claire was no longer the sister. She had become the anchor. It happened gradually. First, an email from a logistics partner was directed to her instead of Ethan. Then a client requested her by name for a renegotiation. Then the quarterly profit sheet arrived, up 15%, and the board didn't ask where Ethan had gone. They just said, "Good work." She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just adjusted her glasses and moved on to the next contract. One night, Margaret asked her, "Do you ever miss being invisible?" Claire paused, hand still on her laptop. "No," she said. "I just got tired of shouting in silence." Meanwhile, Ethan found small victories in repetition. Every morning, he brewed coffee before dawn. Every evening, he cleaned the dishes without prompting. When a loose tile in the hallway caused Margaret's wheelchair to jolt, he quietly went to the hardware store, patched it, and left the receipt on Claire's desk with a sticky note, "Fixed." He didn't ask for reimbursement. One Friday afternoon, Claire came home later than usual. Her shoulders were hunched, blazer wrinkled from a long day of meetings. Ethan noticed her pause by the coat hook, her fingers brushing her forehead. Without a word, he placed a cup of hot green tea on the table beside her laptop. Claire glanced at him, then the cup. "Thanks," she said simply. He nodded, then left the room. That was the first word she'd said to him all week. The next day, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Ms. Claire Sloan, postmarked from Singapore. A foreign investor who had once only entertained deals with the Sloan son now requested a private Zoom meeting with Claire and Claire only. He'd heard about this structural reorg and was impressed with how streamlined operations had become. Claire didn't gloat when she read the letter aloud to Margaret. She didn't look at Ethan either, but she left the letter on the kitchen table, open, where Ethan could see it later. That, he realized, was trust in its first form. Not total, but starting. There were moments that tested him. One afternoon, a former investor accidentally copied him on an email thread praising Claire's no-nonsense leadership. The Ethan of 6 months ago would have replied, tried to reclaim relevance, assert his experience. But this time, he simply read it twice, closed the browser, and returned to scrubbing the sink. At dinner that night, Claire passed him the salt without looking up. And he whispered, "Thanks." It wasn't about seasoning. It was about inclusion. Ethan's greatest trial came a week later, when Vanessa's name popped up in a financial news alert. She'd been implicated in a luxury housing scam, accused of leveraging startup funds from multiple failed ventures, including the branding firm she once promised Ethan would take to IPO. He read the headline once, then deleted the tab. No reaction. No text to friends. No late-night call to confront the ghost of his past. Instead, he got up, checked the locks, and refilled Margaret's water pitcher. That night, as Claire packed documents for a Monday board meeting, she asked softly, "Did you see it?" He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "I did." Silence. Then she added, "You didn't forward it to anyone." "No need," he said. "It's already over." Claire looked up then. Not long, but long enough. That was another step forward. One Sunday, Margaret asked Ethan to help her reorganize the storage closet. As they sifted through old files and forgotten holiday decorations, she pulled out a dusty frame, an old photo of Ethan and Claire, aged around 12 and 8, arms wrapped around a golden retriever that had died long ago. "You hated that dog at first," she said. Ethan chuckled. "He chewed through my favorite sneakers. And you cried like it was the end of the world." He smiled faintly. "It kind of was for me." Margaret traced the frame with her fingers, then handed it to him. "You've lost a lot more since then," she said. Ethan didn't argue. "But you didn't cry this time," she continued. "I didn't have the right to." "No," she corrected. "You had the choice. And you chose something better." He blinked. Then, for the first time in a long while, he said, "I'm still trying." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's all any of us ever did." A week later, Claire invited Ethan to the quarterly review. Not as a participant, just as a note-taker. He didn't protest. He brought a notepad, a pen, and sat quietly in the corner. The team barely acknowledged him. Claire gave her presentation without stammer or pause. She negotiated vendor rates, proposed fleet upgrades, and mapped out international expansion, all with the steady authority of someone who had spent years being underestimated and was now done waiting for permission. When the meeting ended, the CFO pulled Claire aside. "She's the one," he said. "She's the future." Ethan heard it. Every word. He didn't flinch. He was proud. And that was new. Later that evening, as the house settled into its nightly hush, Claire placed a folded paper on Ethan's cot. He opened it after lights out. It wasn't a thank you. It was a task list. Replace hallway bulb. Pick up toner for printer. Reattach trim in mom's room. No signature. No smiley. But it was a sign. He was needed. Not as a savior. Not as a CEO. Just as someone who showed up. And sometimes, that was the biggest opportunity of all. It was a Tuesday. Not a day of grand declarations or any particular significance. The sun filtered into the kitchen in long golden slants, catching the fine dust floating through the air. Margaret sat at her usual spot by the window, wrapped in the same gray shawl Claire had knitted for her the previous winter. Her tea sat untouched, slowly cooling. Claire was late coming home. Her board meeting had run long. Ethan was rinsing out the coffee pot when Margaret spoke. Her voice was low, almost absent-minded. "Ethan," she said, "you don't have a place in the company. But you're not a stranger anymore." The faucet continued to run. Ethan didn't respond right away. He turned it off slowly, wiped his hands, and looked over at her, not with a need for clarification, but with the kind of stillness that only comes when a man is no longer searching for applause. He just nodded once, and Margaret turned her gaze back out the window. That night, Ethan returned to the laundry room and found something that hadn't been there before. A second pillow. Set at the head of the cot, he folded and unfolded each day. Not wrapped in plastic. Not new. Just clean, plumped, and placed with intention. He stared at it for a long moment. There was no note. No ceremony. But it spoke louder than any words Claire had ever said. He wasn't just allowed to stay. He belonged. Not as heir, but as help. The next morning began like all the others. He swept the kitchen floor before Margaret wheeled herself in. He placed her tea just the way she liked it. 2 sugars, no cream, steeped exactly 4 minutes. He didn't wait for thanks anymore. That wasn't the point. He noticed the hallway light flickering again, and by noon, he'd replaced the bulb and rewired the switch box. Margaret watched him from the living room, her expression unreadable, but softer than before. That evening, when Claire came home, she set down her bag and paused in the doorway. She noticed the light. She noticed the tea already made. She noticed the silence. And said nothing. But she did exhale, quietly, like someone slowly releasing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ethan had changed. But it didn't happen like it does in movies. No big speeches. No, "I've seen the light" moments. It happened one towel at a time. One swept floor. One gentle lift of Margaret's legs when the circulation pads needed adjusting. He began learning what needed doing without being told. He recognized the smallest signals. A deeper crease in Claire's forehead when she was tired, a certain twitch of Margaret's wrist that meant the pain meds were wearing off. He became fluent in quiet. There was a day, 2 weeks into this new rhythm, when Claire came home to find a spreadsheet already open on the dining table. It was the shipping ledger. Updated. Color-coded. She looked at Ethan across the table. He was still wearing the same gray t-shirt he always wore when cleaning. His fingers were ink-smudged. There was no trace of pride in his eyes, just patience. "I didn't change anything," he said. "I just fixed the formatting. And backed up the old version, just in case." Claire stared for a moment. Then she sat down and started reading. No praise. No dismissal. Just shared space. Margaret watched them with an old wisdom, the kind that comes when you've outlived the fire of ambition and learned to value the embers of commitment. One night, as she and Ethan sat side by side in the fading light, she asked him, "What do you miss most?" He thought she meant Vanessa, or the office, or the titles. But instead, he said, "Being good at something." She looked at him for a long while. "You were always good at something," she said. "You just didn't know which part mattered most." A month passed. Ethan never moved out of the laundry room. He never asked for anything more. But the room slowly changed. A small bookshelf appeared. A new rug under the cot. Claire didn't question where the money came from, just noted the effort. On the fridge, she started leaving post-it notes. "Pick up toothpaste. Don't forget Mom's compression socks in the dryer. Meeting today, please handle lunch." They weren't requests. They were trust. Ethan's old world never came calling. No one asked him to speak at panels. No podcasts. No phone calls from investors. Vanessa was a ghost in the news, occasionally surfacing in lawsuits or scandal, her name mentioned as a consultant who vanished when things turned bad. Ethan didn't flinch when he saw her face in headlines. He simply folded the paper and continued checking the pantry stock. And then, one evening, just before dinner, Claire came into the kitchen and placed a printed document in front of Ethan. It was a vendor intake form. His name was listed under on-site logistics support. She didn't say anything. Just slid it over with a pen. Ethan blinked. "You sure?" he asked. She didn't smile. She just said, "You've been doing it already." He signed it. And when Margaret asked later what happened at dinner, Claire simply replied, "He's on the books now." Margaret didn't react. But later, when Ethan brought her a fresh cup of tea, she looked up at him and said, "You found your way back." Ethan nodded. "Not to where I was," he said, "but to where I'm supposed to be." He wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a failure either. He was the man who showed up. Every morning. Every night. Every time someone needed something without having to say it out loud. And in the quiet spaces of that small apartment, between flickering lights and warm tea, folded towels and spreadsheets, Ethan found something better than redemption. He found usefulness. And sometimes, that's the most sacred form of grace. The rain hadn't stopped all day. It came down in steady waves, tapping against the window panes of the apartment like a reminder, "You're still here. Keep going." The lights in the living room were dim. The kettle let out a low whistle in the background, and somewhere beyond the walls, thunder rolled across the sky like a soft warning. Margaret asked them both to sit. Claire was sorting payroll documents on the coffee table. Ethan had just finished rewiring the faulty plug near the bookshelf. He dusted off his hands and sank into the armchair across from her, his posture a little less rigid than it used to be. His sleeves were rolled, not pressed. His shoes scuffed, not polished. But there was peace in his face that hadn't been there for years. Margaret took a slow breath before speaking. Her voice had always carried power, even now when time had reduced it to a raspy whisper. She turned to them both and said, "I didn't build all of this to be admired. I built it so someone would inherit it the right way." The room went quiet, save for the drip of rain. Ethan lowered his eyes. He didn't try to explain. No apologies. No speech. Just silence, and that was enough. Margaret turned her gaze to Claire, who met it steadily. "You never reached for power," she said. "You just bent down and picked it up when someone else dropped it. That's why you deserve it." Claire's lips parted as if to answer, but instead she just gave a single, measured nod. No need to speak. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed and the apartment had settled into the soft rhythm of sleep, Claire walked into the kitchen and opened the drawer where they kept the bakery boxes. She pulled out a small one, slipped in a chocolate muffin Margaret liked, and placed a folded piece of paper on top. She left it on the nightstand before she turned in. The note read, "Thank you, Ma. I promise, I won't let it fall apart." In the days that followed, Ethan didn't change anything about his routine. He still rose early, swept the floors, brewed coffee, and refilled Margaret's tea jar. He still made quiet runs to the post office for Claire and picked up dry cleaning without being asked. But something was different now. Not louder, just deeper. He was no longer rebuilding himself for redemption. He was here to hold the weight. 3 months later, Sloan Logistics was named one of the top 10 family businesses to rebound post-pandemic by a national industry magazine. The article credited lean operational shifts, improved back-end systems, and resilient leadership. Claire didn't comment on the feature. She just kept working. But she accepted the award in Boston on a cloudy Wednesday in November. Margaret insisted on watching the live stream. She sat with a blanket on her lap, hands folded neatly, and eyes fixed on the laptop screen. Ethan sat beside her, holding a notebook, pretending not to be nervous. When Claire walked onto the stage, she didn't smile until she reached the microphone. The room in the video hushed. She adjusted the mic slightly. "I was never meant to be the face of this company," she said. "And I'm still not sure I want to be. But what I do know is that this wasn't built for the spotlight. It was built for the storm." She paused, glanced toward the camera, and added, "I didn't inherit power. I continued unfinished work. Work that belonged to someone who never gave up." The room applauded. Margaret closed her eyes slowly, and for the first time in weeks, her shoulders relaxed. Later that night, after the awards sat quietly on the dining table, Claire made tea for all 3 of them. She passed Ethan his cup without comment. Margaret's was placed precisely on the coaster she liked best, the one with the chipped corner from when Ethan dropped it as a boy. Nobody had replaced it. Nobody ever would. Margaret sipped slowly, then asked, "How did it feel?" Claire shrugged gently. Heavy. But not in a bad way. Ethan chuckled. That's kind of how this place feels sometimes. They all laughed, soft and tired but genuine. By the time winter settled in, Ethan had carved out a new rhythm. He still lived in the laundry room, by choice now. He had added shelves, a new lamp, a proper rug. Margaret jokingly called it the monk's quarters. But he never asked to leave it. That was never the point. He wasn't rebuilding a throne. He was guarding the foundation. One day, while fixing a stuck drawer in the hallway cabinet, Ethan paused and stared at a dusty photo of their old warehouse, one of the first buildings Margaret had ever purchased. It was cracked at the edge of the frame, but still intact. He picked it up, brushed off the dust, and mounted it on the wall outside Claire's office. She saw it the next morning and didn't say a word. But she paused, touched the glass lightly, and walked on. Some gestures are too sacred for thanks. In the spring, Margaret's health started to fade further. Her hands trembled more, her appetite thinned, and her voice grew softer. But she never lost clarity. One evening, she asked both her children to sit again. The room looked the same as before, but now the energy was different. Less like tension, more like a baton being passed. "I don't have much time left," she said plainly. "Mom," Claire started, but Margaret held up a hand. "I don't say that to cause grief. I say it because I've seen how easy it is for people to disappear before they're finished saying what matters." She turned to Ethan. "You didn't fall," she said. "You unraveled. And then you learned how to weave again." He didn't look away. He didn't cry. She turned to Claire. "And you, we didn't raise you to lead. But you led anyway, because it needed doing." Then she leaned back, breathing in deeply. "I can rest now. Not because everything is perfect, but because you're both finally here. All the way here." They sat in silence for a long time after that. The kind of silence that wraps around you like an old quilt. Not empty. That night, Ethan stood outside the laundry room, looking at the narrow space he'd come to see as home. He didn't see it as a punishment anymore. He saw it as sacred, because it was where he found humility, where he found purpose, and most importantly, where he learned that being useful wasn't beneath leadership. It was leadership. Weeks later, Margaret passed quietly in her sleep. She was surrounded by the people who had chosen to stay. Not because of blood or legacy, but because they knew how to carry things, even when they were tired. Claire folded her mother's shawl and placed it on her office chair. Ethan brewed the tea that morning without needing to ask which kind. And the house, though quiet, did not feel empty. It felt steady. And that, in the end, was the legacy Margaret had truly built. Not a company, not a name, but a home that stayed standing. Because someone chose not to leave. Sometimes, the most important things we build in life aren't the ones with our name engraved on them, but the ones held together by the people who choose to stay when everything else falls apart. This story wasn't really about power or success. It wasn't about who ran the company or who lost it. It was about the quiet, invisible acts that keep a family from collapsing. Sweeping the floor before anyone wakes up, remembering how someone takes their tea, fixing the light switch without asking. It was about choosing to show up, even when no one is watching. Margaret spent her life building something solid, something she thought would be her gift to the next generation. But in the end, what mattered wasn't who had the best degree or who made the biggest speeches. What mattered was who stayed, who picked up the weight when everyone else stepped back. Claire never demanded anything. She didn't fight for attention. She just did the work. Steady, honest, unseen. Until one day, it couldn't be ignored anymore. And Ethan, well, his journey was the kind many of us are afraid to talk about. He fell. Not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, through ego, comfort, and absence. But the beauty of it? He didn't stay down. He came back. He listened. He learned how to be small again. And in that smallness, he found something greater than any title could give him: humility, usefulness, and peace. We all like to believe legacies are written in big gestures. But the truth is, they're carried in folded towels, second pillows, and one-line notes left in bakery boxes. They live in the quiet moments when we choose responsibility over recognition. This story reminds me that strength isn't about leading from the front. Sometimes, it's about holding the door open, filling the kettle, folding the blanket, and maybe, just maybe, the most lasting impact we leave behind isn't what we built, but who we made stronger by staying.